Liam of Carcanne, Volume 1. Welcome to Carcanne. The bark of the tree scratched at the young man's back through his thin t-shirt. He could feel the dampness of the moss beneath him seeping through his jeans and cooling his legs and backside. Something about the sensations of nature around him comforted him, which was exactly what he needed in this moment. The gentle presence of the glade had pierced him almost instantly as he wandered into it. He couldn't have made it far from where he started before collapsing here. Upon waking up in the woods, he had managed to surprise himself by keeping calm, even if waking up lying in the middle of some unknown forest had come as a bit of a shock. He had managed to assess his situation and quickly piece together what clues he had to formulate a theory for why he was there. Drunken college pranks. All he had to do was call for help and wait for whoever was the first to answer to come pick him up. He'd simply walk his way out of the woods with the help of Google Maps and wait for help to arrive. It was then that he discovered his phone was missing, but still he had kept his cool. He'd simply have to hike out of the forest unaided and find help. He had never had a problem with panic attacks before, and he was only assuming that this is what drove him to collapse against the tree. As he had started his hike out of the woods, the worry set in. How long had he been here? What if he got lost? What if he was already lost? His heart had begun pounding, and his breathing had become short and irregular. His legs started trembling, and he grew dizzy. That was when he parked himself against the tree and sat down. He sat there as wave after wave of panicked energy flowed through him, and he dreaded his current situation more and more. It was like a great wellspring of fear and tension had been opened in his body, and he succumbed to it. His drive to move forward vanished in an instant, and he sat there against the tree. He was already lost in the woods, and now he was becoming lost in his own mind, ready to give up only steps into his journey. Finally, the attack reached its peak, and he felt his body slowly begin to relax. He looked to his wrist to see how long he had been sitting there, only to be reminded of his missing watch. Thinking about it made his chest heave, and he could feel the anxiety and the panic welling up inside himself again. This time, he wouldn't let it win. This time, he'd screwed his eyes shut and forced himself to his feet. The combination of his actions and the spinning sensation still lingering in his head sent him stumbling, but he managed to keep himself from falling. He forced his eyes open and focused on the glade around him. He took in its beauty as a distraction against the pull of the panic. Light filtered gently through bright green leaves, their glow contrasting with the dark brown of the trees they hung from. The whole wood, as far as he could see, glowed with the same verdant green light, trickling down from an early morning sun. At his feet was the thick ground coat of moss whose dampness he had felt through his jeans. It made the outdoor space feel carpeted, curated, as if he was in Disney's representation of a forest. It made the space feel smaller, less overwhelming, which helped stabilize him. Speckled through the trees in no discernible pattern were bushes and shrubs that thickened and thinned depending on the way he swiveled his head. All in all, not a bad place to die, he thought to himself briefly before forcing the idea from his mind. Thoughts like that were not how he was going to get out of these woods, not how he was going to get home. Gathering what gumption he could, he began the long trudge southward, trusting the sun to guide him on his way. There were fewer bushes on this heading than any of the others, as well as a slight downhill that made him feel secure in his decision. As he walked on, he considered why he had been so quick to land on a reason for winding up in these random woods. The night before had been the final night of midterms in what had proven to be the hardest semester Liam had yet experienced in college. His junior year had been particularly rough not because of his chosen major, but because of the dreaded statistics course he had been forced to take by the school. Everyone had to take it, and he had managed to put it off for as long as allowable. Math was not his strong suit. That was why he was a history major, and many of his friends had dreaded the test along with him. Hence the celebrating when they had survived the halfway point of the class. Liam and his friends had gone out drinking to celebrate their completion of what others had claimed was the roughest half of the class. They had gone out to their favorite local bar. When their favorite local bar got tired of them, they went to their second favorite bar, and then their third. After that, Liam lost count as to just which bars they had gone to, and which bars had been their favorites, and what his general purpose in the world had been. It was around this time in the night that his memory began to grow fuzzy and fade. The next thing he was aware of was the dampness of the dew on his face as he woke up in the woods less than an hour ago. Obviously, this had been his friend's idea of a sick joke. He passed out between bars, and they thought it would be funny if he woke up in the woods somewhere. Soon he would emerge from the trees to find himself in some park 2 towns over from their college, and he'd have to find some way to call for a ride. Had it really been necessary for them to take his phone? I'm going to kill them, he thought as he walked on. I'm going to kill them, and then I'm going to turn the browser histories over to their parents. He continued on for what the passing of the sun told him was close to 2 hours, and nevertheless there was no sign of a road or path. There was no way to make good time without one. He was constantly turning off course to go around boulders and thickets of thorny bushes, which he knew accounted for a lot of time, but he was starting to wonder just how big this park actually was. Had they driven him out to a nature preserve someplace? No matter the answers to his questions, one thing was for certain: he had chosen the wrong direction. There was no way any of his friends would have dragged him for more than a few minutes from their car. His legs were beginning to burn from all the hiking, as was his stomach from the lack of breakfast. These were the things he was concentrating on as he stepped out from behind a large collection of boulders that had caused his most recent detour. A few feet from the edge of the rocks, only yards from where he stood, Liam found himself staring at the backside of a large gray and brown wolf. The large predator had yet to notice Liam, but that didn't stop the fear that coursed through his veins. The feeling was different from the overwhelming sense of dread and panic he had experienced at the start of this adventure. That had been a great building up of pressure against the walls of his mind, and the overwhelming feeling of screams trying to force their way out of his chest, a cold and intelligent dread. This was different, less civilized. The fear that the wolf evoked burned from deep inside some forgotten part of his brain. It surged up from his belly, hot and angry. Where the panic had zapped his strength and will, this terror invigorated him. It gave his body and muscles new purpose, and that purpose was survival. Everything in him told him to bolt, to take off at a dead run in the opposite direction. But he managed to hold the urges back. The wolf was massive, bigger than he had ever seen in a zoo, easily close to 5 feet at its shoulders. He knew that if he startled it, if he drew its attention, he was a dead man. Slowly, quietly, he backed away from the feeding creature. His movement was painstakingly slow against the cry of his muscles to run, but he managed to back away behind a tree without the wolf spotting him. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and relaxed. Behind him, he could hear the crunching of the wolf eating its meal, and his skin shivered. He took another step forward, keeping the tree between him and the predator, when the sound of a snapping twig under his foot spooked him. That was all it took, a small jolt to his system for him to lose control and his instincts to take over. Before he could reassert command over his legs, they sprang into action. They pushed off with such force that they launched him forward into a sprint logic couldn't control. For minutes he ran, paying little attention to the direction, without so much as a sound from behind him. In the distance ahead, he could hear a dull roar filtering through the trees, and his feet chose to chase it. As he ran, he risked a glance behind him, but could make out nothing among the trees and bushes he left in his wake. Remembering the stories of attacks from old nature documentaries, he kept scanning the space around him in case it attacked him from the side, but he saw nothing. Then, from somewhere far behind him, he heard it. A long, lazy howl drifted across the woods before finding its way to his ears. The fire burning in his gut pushed more power to his legs, and he tried his best to outrace a wolf. In his high school days, Liam had spent a lot of time running for his school's track team. He was never going to be the star. He had earned no scholarships, but he had done well enough in his meets. While it had been years since his track and field life had ended, he still ran for fitness when his college and social schedules allowed. Even then, the uneven ground of the forest floor was proving tricky, but nowhere near impossible for him. Flying over a downed log like it was a hurdle proved he was out of practice, however, as his landing was awkward and cost him valuable seconds. Despite the obstacles, he finally broke out of the trees into a large open space where in front of him raged the source of the noise he had instinctively been chasing. Before him, a fast-flowing river tore its way through the forest, the water slamming into great boulders in its depths as it spun and swirled its way past. Still on the move, Liam ran along its bank looking for a clear path to the opposite side. What he found was less than ideal, but that didn't matter at a time like this. Keeping his feet moving, he wheeled himself around the river and ran straight for a large boulder sitting half out of the water. Planting the sole of his sneaker against the rock, he shot himself up its side as hard as he could and scampered, rather undignified, to the top of the boulder. Without pausing to think, he ran as fast as he could manage across the rough surface and leapt through the air. His feet caught the top of the next massive stone, and his upper body fell forward. His hands scuffed against the rock and burned as he fell onto his chest, but managed to stay on the rock. Looking up for his next landing pad, his mind raced as he gathered himself for another running leap. This time, he nearly overshot the rock, landing on the far side of it. He forced himself up onto tiptoe and waved his arms to keep himself from toppling into the fast-moving water. The next jump was just as precarious, but he made it with similar ease. Following another leap onto another large boulder, Liam stopped briefly to look around. Halfway across the river now, he could make out the rest of his path back to dry land. The spray from the river rushing around him was cold and might have been refreshing in different circumstances. He glanced back to the side of the river he had escaped from and spotted the cause of his flight. Stalking its way out of the woods on the eastern bank of the river, its snout and chest covered in the blood of the deer, was the long gray and brown wolf. Its movements were cautious, far more cautious than Liam's had been, but still it came. It leapt with little effort up onto the first boulder in Liam's stepping stone escape. He watched as it sized up and, to his horror, leapt to the next boulder in the sequence. Groaning deep down inside, Liam turned his attention back to the rocks and made the next jump with little issue. Not stopping to look back, Liam bunched himself up and sprung for the next rock. He came up short when only one of his feet caught hold, and the other dipped into the frigid water of the river. Quickly, before he could slide off, he threw himself forward and landed his chest against the rock with a painful thud. He pulled his foot from the water and looked back to see the wolf already landing neatly only a few stones away. Liam turned to the next and smallest rock in the sequence. Making himself ready for the next leap, he twisted his feet back and forth, and his wet shoe slipped on the rock, almost costing him a trip into the water. He dug his wet shoe harder into the stone before committing to the jump. He recoiled and sprang for the small rock. His feet landed where he had wanted, neatly on top of the stone, but then suddenly they flew out from under him as the soles of his shoes failed to grip the slippery surface. He landed with a crack on his rear and slid off of the stone into the icy water. The cold drove the air from his lungs, but he fought the urge to suck in more air for fear of pulling in water. Caught in the current, Liam tumbled downstream for over 100 yards before finally regaining his orientation and managing to get his head above the water. It was a miracle his skull hadn't been split on another rock. Fighting as hard as he could, he swam with the current, but even that proved exhausting as he cut closer to the western shore of the river. Reaching out, he managed to grab a boulder as he floated by and pulled himself up onto the rock. Panting hard and drained, he lifted his head to try and get eyes on the wolf. The creature had stopped several boulders before the one Liam had slipped off and paused. He could see it looking downriver as if trying to find him again. It took its time, scanning the rocks until Liam was sure it laid eyes on him, half drowned on his boulder. It seemed to contemplate the path Liam had taken before letting out another much deeper howl than before, as if it were letting its disappointment be known. When it lowered its head again, it took another long look at the college junior before turning back the way it had come, jumping neatly from boulder to boulder. Liam let out a sigh as his head fell back to the rock beneath him. Moving cautiously, Liam hopped from boulder to boulder away from where he had pulled himself out of the water. Every skip and hop took him closer to the safe western shore of the river. Once there, Liam lay out on the bank and allowed himself time to breathe and dry off. He watched the clouds float aimlessly across the sky and enjoyed the rumble of the river with the mid-morning sun on his face. He had just outrun a wolf, granted with a healthy head start, but he figured he deserved a bit of a break now that he was safe. It was only in this peace-filled moment that Liam took the time to notice, through the gap in the trees cut by the river, that to the north stood a row of high mountains still capped with snow. That explains why the water's so cold, he spoke aloud to himself. Snow runoff. As he lay on the bank, he found his thoughts clouded and it hard to concentrate. It was difficult to piece together any ideas he had while lying there. He wrote it off as exhaustion and stress from his recent near-death experience. However, he couldn't help but think that just maybe he should have tried for those track scholarships after all. After resting for close to an hour, he propped himself up on one arm and took his first real look at the woods on this side of the river. They looked to be just as inviting as the other side, though the leaves were a different shape and shade of green. Despite their darker color and more angular cut, the sun's rays still lit up the forest from high above. More important than the changes in trees, at least to Liam, was the sight of a well-traveled footpath cut into the woods a dozen yards from where he had been resting. Before carrying on with the journey, he returned to the water and risked drinking his fill from cupped hands. The water was cold and refreshing now that he wasn't desperately trying to not breathe it. With his thirst sated, but his hunger only growing, he left the river and continued on his journey. Moving through the last few yards of wilderness and onto the path wasn't nearly as freeing or momentous as he had hoped. In fact, he felt his heart slump and disappointment surge. Yes, any sign of civilization was welcome at this point, but this was a far way off from the paved road or parking lot he had been hoping for. The path was a well-traveled hiking trail that meandered through the woods no matter which direction he looked. It seemed endless to him, but still more inviting than the slog through the wilderness he had put himself through for most of the morning. Having nothing to go on other than the course of the river and the position of the mountains, Liam turned southward and followed the flow of the water downhill. The trail meandered alongside the river, only leaving its side to skirt boulders or to make for more convenient crossings where creeks or brooks joined its chaotic flow. It was a good thing his shoes were already soaked, as there was no bridges or stepping stones for these crossings, which was fine by Liam. He'd already had his fill of bouldering for the day. For the next couple of hours on the trail, Liam seemed to be constantly reliving his flight from the wolf. Suddenly, he would feel his feet pounding into the ground without changing his pace. The fear and tension in his body would return, and he would become paranoid that the wolf was just around any corner, or worse of all, behind him. Just when he thought he had it back under control, some sound in the woods would dig up his paranoia again, and the feelings would flood back. Finally, as the sun passed midday, his small hiking trail joined a larger dirt road, and he felt some relief. The road was thin, maybe wide enough for a single car, but there were no ruts or tire tracks to be seen. It continued the trail's generally southward path from where it joined, but northward it veered away from the river and headed northwest. Letting out a large sigh and feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders, Liam walked out into the middle of the dirt road and continued following the gentle downhill slope. Walking in the middle of the road with plenty of open space around him did wonders for his mental state. Every footstep fell with caution, and if he was honest, he was still a fair bit scared, but he found the added space around him to be helpful. Just the illusion that he might see something coming helped calm his nerves. There would be no accidentally stumbling on another feeding predator on this path. As he walked on, he still found no signs to indicate where he was or what direction to travel on the road. He did, however, find his ability to think functional thoughts returning, almost as though just the act of walking on a civilized roadway again was bringing a bit of his higher brain functions back online. He scoffed at the idea he might have gone feral in such a short period of time. Where the hell am I? He finally found himself asking the trees around him. Despite the insanity of his day thus far, they did not answer. Those mountains, he said, turning to look up the road while continuing his walk backward. They're on the wrong side of the valley, right? Liam had been attending college in a small town in California's Central Valley. If there were mountains to his north, which the motion of the sun overhead confirmed, then they must have driven him over 3 hours north of the school. Damn, those guys were dedicated to a gag, he said, turning back around and walking in the correct orientation. Even then, Liam had this sense that everything wasn't quite right, as if he was walking through the beautiful version of the uncanny valley. The greens were very green, the sunlight bright even though it had to travel some distance through the trees to reach him. Were these even the right kinds of trees? The right weather for Northern California in April? He shook it off. He had been through a lot this morning. Just that was enough to account for a change in his perception of his reality. Maybe this was that heightened state of awareness everyone always talked about after a near-death experience. He carried on walking. The road curved one final time before breaking free of the shade of the forest. Rounding the bend, the glow of the greenish light projected through the leaves of the trees came to a sudden end, as if someone had built a wall to hold back the harsh, bright sunlight of the rest of the world. Stepping through this wall without hesitation and into that bright light blinded Liam, hurting his eyes as they fought to compensate. When they finally did adjust, what lay before him was almost as beautiful as the woods he was leaving behind. His road continued on a downhill slope, its course following the river even closer now that there were no trees to separate the two. It curved along the rich blue and white water until finally meeting up with another large dirt road that ran east-west along the floor of a large valley. The river continued past the new road, under a proper bridge, until it eventually joined up with another river of similar size that also ran the length of the valley floor. The new road cut through the center of the valley, filled with lush green grasses and the occasional stand of trees. Though he couldn't see them from where he stood, it wasn't hard to imagine farms nestled in among the grasses of the plains. On the east-west road he could just make out a couple of hikers heading west, but they were too far away for any yelling he could have made to reach them. What there wasn't any sign of was a parking lot, a paved road, or any cars. Liam knew that it must have taken the guys hours to dump him out here, wherever he was. If he hadn't been sure he hadn't drank enough, he would have thought he passed out for an entire day while they rushed him off to wherever he was. Yosemite, he found himself theorizing aloud. Did they drop me off in one of those little valleys you always hear about hikers getting lost in? Keeping an eye on his surroundings, in part for safety and in part to just enjoy them, Liam left the woods behind him with no new answers. It took just over an hour for Liam's feet to step off of the forest road and out onto the much larger dirt highway. This new road was wider than the last, still hard-packed dirt, but now it was easily a two-lane road, if not a little bigger. On the shoulders of the highway, Liam could see boot prints from other hikers that must have been out roaming trails like the one he had stumbled upon. Despite its size, he couldn't help but feel the road was little traveled by cars, as running closer to the center of the road were four thin ruts that seemed to carry on forever in either direction. This time, finally, there was at least a sign with two names and arrows pointed in either direction. To his west, heading uphill towards the mountains at the western end of the valley, was Fort Grensgatting. Odd name for a fort, Liam commented to the sign. He didn't recall that one from his state history classes. To his east, following the downhill directions of the rivers to where the valley seemed to open up further, was Stawson. Never heard of that one either, he said, letting a sharp breath out of his nose. And of course, there's no mile markers on the sign. He looked to the sky in his frustration, but instead of the mighty roar that had been brewing in him since waking up in the woods, his shoulders dropped and he let out a sigh of defeat. Dropping his head, he turned and headed east towards Stawson. He trudged along the highway, his course taking him parallel to the woods he had awoken in. As he crossed the wooden bridge that was built over the river, it wasn't lost on him that he was backtracking. When he realized he was technically back on the side of the river where he had left the wolf, his mind threatened to betray him again, but he managed to push forward. Coming down off the bridge, he finally spotted something useful. Coming up the dirt highway, sat on the back of an ox-pulled cart of all things, were two people making their way in his direction. He became practically giddy with excitement at the sight of the couple, and was only able to keep himself from running up to the cart as it approached. Liam stepped to the side to give the animals some room, but waved his hands to try and draw the attention of the man and woman driving them. It was all probably unnecessary, as he could have easily kept pace with the cart. The oxen weren't exactly setting any land speed records. He felt, however, that this course of action was the most polite. "Excuse me," Liam's voice cracked as he yelled over the grinding of the wheels and the ruts of the road. The cart rumbled to a stop, and Liam got his first good look at his saviors. Both were dressed in light-colored linen clothes that hung loose from their bodies. The man had a simple tunic and breeches with what Liam thought were cowhide boots, and the woman wore a sundress with shoes of similar fashion. They appeared to Liam as if they were participating in a LARP event, one that they were very dedicated to the look of. And what was with the cart and oxen? "Sorry for stopping you." Liam stepped closer to speak with the woman who sat on the driver's side of the cart, but she held up a hand to stop him when he got too close. He stopped and eyed the oxen, assuming that was why he had been warned off. When she produced a long knife from between her and her companion and laid it across her lap in an obvious show, he understood they didn't trust him. "I'm lost, you see, and, well, He eyed the knife closely for a moment before peeling his eyes back up to the woman's face. Her expression appeared far kinder than her actions would suggest. "I was wondering if you had a cell phone I could borrow to call my friends? Maybe give me a ride back to the trailhead?" "There's no room in this wagon for free rides, I'm afraid," the woman said coldly but not disrespectfully. "And I'm not sure what a—" She paused to confer with her partner for a moment. "We've never heard of a spell phone." "Where do you get such interesting clothes?" the man asked before Liam could respond. He leaned forward to see around the woman from his place on the far side of the wagon. She elbowed him back out of her personal space before shooting him a look of annoyance. "You'll have to ignore him," she apologized as she obviously looked Liam up and down. "He's always the merchant." "These?" Liam looked down at his filthy and wrinkled ensemble. It had been one of his more decent outfits, mid-range designer jeans and a t-shirt, a now ruined pair of limited edition Chuck Taylors. Amazon mostly. "They're definitely unique," the woman offered before gathering the reins as if to leave. "We're in a terrible rush and have to get a move on. If you'll—" "Well, look." Liam cut her off and stepped forward again. The woman's hand instantly fell to the knife in her lap, and her expression turned cold. This time he stood his ground. "I really am lost. I don't know what kind of thing you two have going on here, But if you have a phone, our thing, her voice grew sharper as she cut him off, is that we are already too late to make it to the fort before dark, and you are slowing us down. Stawson is a few miles east of here, the man said, reappearing from around the woman. Maybe someone there has what you're looking for. At the very least, they can point you to wherever it is you're trying to go. Can you at least tell me where I am? Liam pleaded. How do you not? The merchant woman started, but the man tugged at her arm to cut her off. After he whispered something into her ear, the woman turned in her seat and took a good long look at Liam. Her features softened, and she let out a low sigh. Liam looked down to see what had changed her demeanor and frowned at his own appearance. His shoes were still caked in mud from all the creek crossings back in the woods. His wet clothes had attracted half of the dust from the highway, and his disheveled hair made him appear as though he hadn't bathed in a month. He was a pitiful sight. You're in Broadman, on the King's Great Cardinal Road. The western branch, the man cut in. Between Stawson and Fort Gransgadding, near the border with Usniak, he said matter-of-factly, but there was no hiding the apparent pity that had replaced her frustration. Usnia? Liam said to himself, the couple easily caught on to the confusion in his tone. The neighboring kingdom of Usnia, the man explained, seemingly surprised the description hadn't clued Liam in instantly. Just the other side of the Gap Pass, in the mountains there, he pointed to the peaks in the direction the couple was heading. Liam became more and more confused. Gap Pass, Usnia. He'd grown up in the state, and he'd never heard of any of these places. How far could his friends have taken him? Canada? Did you get to Canada in a night from Central California? Yes, but where is this? He finally asked again. The couple shared a worried glance between the two of them. I told you. Rodman, the Northwest Dukedom. The woman answered again, her patience waning. Look, if you're that lost, just follow the road east. You'll come to Stawson eventually, but we can't waste any more time here. It's not safe to be alone on this stretch of the road after dark, not this close to the woods. I don't know where any of those places are, Liam insisted, seemingly in his own world as he ignored the woman's warning. You're in the Kingdom of Carcanne, the man said absent-mindedly, as he reached for his partner's arm to signal her they should be moving on. Carcanne, where's... Stawson is east of here, the woman spoke slowly and loudly as she cut him off. I recommend going there. If you travel west to the fort, you'll likely be arrested for desertion or banditry or whatever it is that has you out here. Without waiting for a response, she ushered the oxen forward and the wagon began to crawl westward again. Liam turned to walk with them a moment, his brain racing with all kinds of questions he needed answered. Finally, he settled on one and asked them before they could pull away entirely. What's the date? He raised his voice over the rumbling of the cart's wheels. April 3rd, the woman yelled back over her shoulder. The day after midterms. How could he have made it to another country, especially one he had never heard of, in a single night? His Majesty's year 691, the man yelled over the back of the moving cart. 691. Liam watched them as they pulled away. 691. Did they expect him to believe he was 1,300 years in the past? It can't be 691. There were no carts like that in Europe in the 7th century, he said to himself as if his statement held the power to deny the couple's very existence. English, not as they'd been speaking it, didn't even exist in the 7th century. There was no way they'd have been able to understand each other, yet they had. He looked at the world around him as he walked. That nagging feeling he had in the woods returned. Everything just seemed slightly off. The colors a little too vibrant, the air too crisp. If it was impossible that he had been sent back in time, then what would have caused this change in his perception? He'd never had a hangover do this before. Come to think of it, he hadn't had a hangover all day. After a night like last night, he should be barely functioning. Liam continued to turn reasons why the couple had acted so strangely over in his mind as he walked on. Nothing he came up with made any sense. Were they actually just a couple of people over-dedicated to a live-action role-playing weekend? He highly doubted it. The back of the wagon had been completely full of furs, vegetables, and other tradable goods. Probably a couple of $1,000s worth. Could they have simply been Amish? He'd never heard of an Amish community that didn't use the modern calendar, nor one that dressed as though it were the Middle Ages. Also, the man had specifically said the King's year. What king could he have meant? Within minutes, Liam had more answers than he had been able to drum up all day, but he was no closer to being any less confused now than when he woke up that morning. If anything, his confusion was worse now than it had been in the forest. He pressed on eastward along the road, hoping he might find more answers in Stawson, wherever and whatever that was. As he walked, he came across a handful of other people, all dressed similarly to the couple on the cart, most on foot like him. The people all seemed polite enough, but he didn't dare stop any of them on their journeys out of fear of just what answers they'd have for his questions. The more people he passed, the more steps he took toward the east, the more withdrawn into himself he felt. The further from home he felt. It had been hours now since he last saw someone. His legs burned, his stomach demanded to be fed, and his last drink of water had been back at the river. In the distance, the dull, flickering lights of Stawson finally came into view as Liam crested one final hill late into the night. The sight of civilization made his heart pound in his chest, and his hopes, for the first time since finding the road through the woods, soared. Pressing on now, though still painful, was far less difficult with the end of his suffering within reach. Soon he would have answers to his questions. He kept his hopes up for a nice, simple explanation, but deep down he feared the worst. If it was all a prank, he would call for help in town and head home. There he would finally eat something and rest. After that, he would call the police on his so-called friends. Sure, they might have meant this as some kind of joke, but he had almost drowned running from that wolf, and he refused to think of what would have happened had it caught up to him. Then there had been the endless walking, and he'd been threatened with a knife. This wasn't funny, it was torture. The fear was that something else was happening, something impossible but still worrisome. He had read books growing up, Wizard of Oz, Chronicles of Narnia, The Castle in the Attic. It all featured people transporting to other worlds. It was a popular genre in anime these days. Isekai, it was called. It was all far too crazy to believe, but he was running out of ideas for what else it could have been. Drawing closer with every step, the lights of Stawson flickered in front of Liam as he pressed on. Soon he began passing small buildings along the road, sheds and hovels that had been placed outside of the town because the land was cheaper or the people were outright squatting. It wasn't long before Liam found himself walking between the less hastily built and more permanent structures of the town proper, and he was blown away by what he saw. What he had been holding out hope was a small Sierra trading post, or a ranger station in a park, was, in fact, a sizable medieval-style town. The buildings lining the highway were mostly built of stone, though some were half-timbered with thatched roofs. The houses started low and wide, packed together in groups with tiny yards separating them. Slowly, the yards disappeared as he walked further into town, where eventually the buildings grew thin and tall, resembling old row houses he had seen in history books. The windows at street level were all dark, but he could spot the faint glow of candle or perhaps lamplight in the occasional second-floor window. Under his feet, there was a sudden shift from dirt to cobblestone, and Liam felt it all sink in. "So much for calling for help," he muttered as he pressed on. With every step, he could make out more and more details of whatever version of historical life this was all supposed to represent. There were anachronisms everywhere: sewer grates, pump wells, oil-burning street lamps, a shop selling good quality glasswares that shouldn't exist for another 1,000 years, if it really were 691. Built into the ground floor of most of these houses were businesses with shingles hung over their door: baker, cobbler, milliner. It seemed all of the old world trades were well represented in town. Every so often, with no discernible pattern, there would be a break in the buildings, and another street would run off from the highway to continue the town in another direction. Everywhere he looked were the trappings of a medieval town, but it was all too clean, too well kept. Like someone pressure-washed the buildings before his arrival, but far deeper. It was all so well built, however, that it felt truly genuine. There was no Disney sightline tricks, no forced perspective here. It's a sizable town with no discernible modern features. No cars, no electricity, no phone lines overhead. "There's no way this all exists in some park in the woods without me hearing about it," he said to himself as he fought to take it all in. Continuing to follow the main highway, the Cardinal Road as the traders had called it, Liam would pause briefly at the crossroads of the township and look on as far as he could in the dim light. On one such stop, Liam spotted a familiar symbol hanging over the door of a small shop. A badge. Deviating from the main highway, Liam approached the business to find the lights turned out and the door locked. True to his suspicion, the word constable was painted on the solid wood door, but they appeared to be closed for the night. What kind of town closes the police department at night? He questioned the front door before spotting what appeared to be a bulletin board hung over the front window of the office. The letters were hard to make out in the faint light cast by the street lamps, but Liam managed. Everything was written in plain English, modern English at that. Somehow only made things worse. Occasionally there was a sigil he didn't recognize scattered in amongst the words, but their meaning was easy enough to discern if you paid attention to the words surrounding them. They mostly seemed to reference specific entities or jobs like a logo or trademark might back home. If I can read all of this, he thought aloud, then this isn't the past. Liam stepped back from the announcements board and looked up and down the side street. Deciding that his plan would be to return to the constable's office in the morning, he turned from the bulletins. Tired and defeated, Liam walked away from the constable's office and headed down the side street. It wasn't long before the street lamps disappeared and the cobbles gave way back to dirt, but the buildings on either side of the roads continued on. Soon he found himself wandering the city by what moonlight made it into the streets. The haphazard layout of the town made it easy to wander for some time without retracing your steps, and he gladly did so. The more he walked, the more the fear and panic welled up inside of him. As unlikely as it all was, he couldn't help but fear he was far from home, so far that a way back would not simply present itself when the constable's office opened in the morning. In his mind, he felt the wolf rejoin him on the streets, mixed with the dread he had experienced in the woods, as if at any moment it might appear from around a corner and devour him whole. This time he found himself without the energy needed to fight off the fear and panic. He felt his thoughts haze over again like they had on the riverbank, and he wandered off into the night, scared and alone. It was in his paranoid glancing around every corner that he spotted the steeple of a church in the distance. Continuing at his new cautious pace, he pointed himself in the direction of the beacon and walked on. Liam found the church among the small, modest stone homes that formed a line against the grass prairies on the eastern outskirts of town. The building itself was a short, single-story chapel of no more than 1,000 square feet, nestled into the center of a lush, walled garden. Making up for its humble size, the church was made of elaborate stonework with windows of stained glass. The walls of the garden carried the themes and shapes of the building in far simpler terms. Approaching its western wall, Liam could see that the structure still managed to dwarf many of the homes that surrounded it. Set into the wall was an intricate iron gate that Liam found to be unlocked. The gate hinges squealed as Liam opened it just far enough to allow him to slip into the garden, and then did his best to close it quietly. The garden itself was well manicured, full of raised garden beds growing vegetables, fruit trees, and berry bushes, with vibrant flowers dotted throughout, giving the space a practical yet exotic feel. Liam could feel the difference in the air here. It was somehow denser, still, like the air after a rainstorm's sudden end. Turning off of the cobble path just before the chapel doors, Liam stepped onto the gravel that ran between the planters. He made his way down a row of berry bushes that was walled on the opposite side by the chapel itself. Quietly, he snacked on as many berries as his mouth could take while passing the plants. His sense of guilt was overtaken by his hunger as he moved on to a grapefruit tree and took two for himself. He stuffed one into his pocket and peeled and ate the other as he slowly followed the path alongside the chapel. He shoved the peels into another pocket to dispose of later. He might be stealing a few fruits, but he could at least be kind enough to not make a mess of things. At the end of the gravel path, sitting near the low north wall of the garden, he spotted an apple tree full of fruit. His shoes crunched the gravel beneath his feet as his pace quickened and he fixated on the tree. Stepping out from between the chapel and berry bushes, he felt his heart leap into his throat. Automatically, his body tried to leap away from the sudden danger it had sensed around the corner of the building, but when its path was blocked by berry bushes, he instead drew himself into as small a ball as his body could manage. This was it. The wolf was back, and there would be no escape this time. He cowered, waiting for it to spring on him. But when death didn't come quickly, he opened his eyes to see the source of his fear. Rounding the corner of the building had put him directly in the path of a large stone statue, the perfect likeness of a maternal beauty in her late 40s. She was probably 7 feet tall, but hunched down with her right hand extended as if she were offering something to whoever approached. The lush curves of her body were covered in loose-fitting robes that she clutched to her chest with her other hand for modesty's sake. Her face was set in a strong but neutral expression. She was judging no one, but she was having none of whatever guff you brought before her. The expression drew Liam in for a time. There was something in her face he found familiar, and that familiarity he found comforting in this strange day. All at once he felt the urge to crawl into her arms and seek comfort like you might do with a beloved friend or lover, and the overwhelming safety that he hadn't felt since childhood. In these moments he felt the wolf that had been hunting him through town flee, as the well of fear inside him was closed off. For the first time since waking that morning, he felt the burden of concern lift and his shoulders relaxed. Pulling his eyes from her face, the overwhelming nature of the feelings passed, but deep down their core soothing effect remained. Looking to see where she beckoned, he spotted a long wooden bench nestled in a stone hutch built into the garden wall. Whether a trick of the moonlight or his own strained mind, Liam would later swear he had seen the statue motion towards the bench. "Thank you," he whispered to her, convinced she could hear him, before walking towards the bench. As he moved away from the statue, the aches and pains of the day fell from his body, and the exhaustion took him. He barely made it to the bench in time to lie down before the world around him swirled into darkness. His last thoughts as he passed into a restful night's sleep were of his own mother, and her insisting that nothing could hurt him so long as he was in the walls of this garden. Liam of Carcanne was written and read for you by Will Hansen. For more information on Liam or any of Will's other works, please visit the Wooks Books Facebook page, Twitter, or YouTube channel. If you'd like to show your support, please like, subscribe, rate, and leave a comment where available. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time.